Hello everyone. Welcome to the IAAP 2017 webinar series. Our presentation today is Accessible Design for an Aging Population. My name is Kevin Hauer of IAAP, and Sharon Spencer is also with us today. Before we start, I want to quickly review a few things. Everyone should be logged into Adobe Connect, or you can follow along with the presentation provided and over the phone. To access the presentation, there is a handout link in the confirmation email that you received when you registered, as well as in the reminder email that we sent out a few days ago. During the webinar today, if you want to ask questions, our speakers do plan to stop for a few points of questions, but you can also ask them at the end. We'll try and leave a little window there as well. Please ask any questions in the chat area if possible. If not, please save your questions for the end and we'll be able to unmute you and you can ask verbally that way. To unmute yourself at that time, you can use the command #6 on your phone, and then you can use *6 to put yourself back on mute. But again, we do ask that you try and save those questions for the end. If you are hearing audio over both your computer speakers and your phone, you can either hang up the phone and listen via the computer, or you can mute your computer and listen over the phone. There is a full screen option to see the PowerPoint better. Selecting the option again will let you leave the full screen option and get back to the chat window. And I wanted to remind everyone that we are recording this webinar and it will be available as an archive after this session. So thank you again for joining us today. Our session is Accessible Design for an Aging Population. Today's speakers are Suzanne Keohane and Bo Campbell of IBM. Suzanne is a global research leader for the Strategic Initiative on Aging. She is an expert in enabling human ability through accessible ICT with a strategic focus on aging-related research, cloud-based personalized access, and adaptive interfaces. Bo joined IBM Accessibility as an accessibility design consultant in 2013 after more than 10 years as a user experience designer. He specializes in interaction design. We are delighted to have Suzanne and Bo with us as today's speakers. Thank you again for doing this webinar, and I will turn things over to you.
Is everything set now? Okay, perfect. So sorry about that, everyone. I'm excited to be here. Our topic is the accessible design for an aging population. And you all might know this, but aging is happening. We're all doing it every day. For the past 10 years, I've been really focused on accessibility research for IBM. How to make technology accessible to people with disabilities, blind, deaf, hard of hearing, cognitive disabilities. I'm also part of the W3C Cognitive Task Force coming up with emerging standards to help people with cognitive disabilities, use technologies. What was interesting to me is that aging seemed to be a logical transition as a new area to do research. One, because of the demographic shift, and I'll cover that in a second. And two, as we age, unfortunately, most of us will have physical and cognitive decline. We will acquire disabilities, and not necessarily one at a time. They kind of slowly onset. So the idea of how to best understand a person's needs as those needs change over time, to me, this was really fascinating, and having that core accessibility understanding is really key to kind of understand this problem. So I want to introduce you to Violet Brown. She's a super centenarian. As of last week, she is the oldest living person in the world. Unfortunately, the previous older person had passed away, who was also 117. And the reason I think this is interesting is we often think about, living to 100. If you ask people how long do you think you'll live for, sometimes you have to talk to, insurance agents about this topic. Most people will say 90, mid-90s, and, maybe 100 is optimistic. But what if you have 20 more years? Think about that. You know, that's 20 more birthdays. How many more sunsets is that in your life? That is a substantially longer period of time. And what I also think is, you know, 117 looks amazing to live that long. But what was super interesting, if you look at the top 100 oldest people in the world, they're all over 110. I mean, to even get on that list, you have to live to 110, and there's already, you know, 100 people. So the idea that we are living longer, it's here, it's happening, and there's, you know, a lot of reasons for that. But how do we really generate a quality of life? How do we age in a world where technology is upon us, and how do we bridge that gap? And you know, most of us here have accessibility roots, so we understand the problem at its core, but now we get to apply it to a more broader audience, because again, we're all aging. So this is not just applicable to one set of people, it starts to become applicable to everyone. So let me show you the trends on aging. The world is aging at historic rates. Japan is leading the charge. They are the most aged society. 1 in 4 people are over 65. That's about 25% of their population, 35 million people. And it sounds like a lot, right? 1 in every 4 people is over 65. But in a country like China, who is aging at around the same rate as the U.S., there's approximately 150 million people that are over 65 today. 150 million. They have a one-child policy. They did. I mean, they recently overturned that. So most of this generation that is over 65 has just one child to help care for them. It's the fastest growing elder population. So what gets really interesting, countries like this really do look towards technology to help these elders, help them stay connected, help them stay healthy, help them and help monitor them, keep them safe. So what if there is that technology gap? What do we do? And again, we're going to get into how we address it, but this is really just kind of stating the overall why aging matters and why it's challenging. So one thing on a global trend is, for the first time in history, there are more people over 65 than children. And these, you know, even in a country like India and Egypt, who doesn't have a very high percentage of elders in their population, they still have that upward trend of, you know, more and more people in their society will be, you know, older. So this is impacting nearly every national infrastructure, global economies. And another interesting fact is the total GDP spend for elders in the U.S. for caring for elders and all the social services and stuff we offer will double in the next 4 years. So the reason I bring this up is, you know, often motivating factors could be the benefit of a market share. And when you look at this population trend and you see that the aging population is steadily growing, becomes a huge market share. This becomes an interest to many people. And when you have that market share, that's a chance to really drive accessibility even further than we have today. More people understand it, more people can empathize it, more people are living with it. So it becomes much, you know, touching of people's lives, and that's important. And so I think we're at a great opportunity with this aging demographic to really, really kind of change how our relationship with technology is and how to address that barrier to technology. So one of the other charts I wanted to show you is the prediction for 2050. These numbers are staggering. You know, if you think of in the U.S., almost 30% of the people will be over 60. Again, the countries like Singapore, 40% would be over 60. You know, the population pyramid, if you're familiar with that, it's shaped as a pyramid. Normally, the younger generation, there's more of that demographic, and as you age, it becomes less and less. Well, it's totally changing shape. It looks more like a skyscraper because almost every demographic has equal share in society. And again, the aging demographic, if you look at it, it becomes one that is acquiring physical and cognitive disabilities. So again, when we think of accessibility standards, kind of pushing forward why accessibility matters and the adoption of it, this becomes a really interesting space because governments have to be interested, as I mentioned earlier, and they are. So in the EU, there are several grants to better understand how technology can help with the aging demographic, and that technology is going to have to be accessible. Even the U.S. government, I had a chance to speak to our previous CTO of the U.S. government, Megan Smith, and there was a paper issued, a report on from the U.S. President's Council of Science and Technology on the independence, the technology, and the connection in older age. And so more and more governments are focused on this issue. And again, I just want to reiterate, accessibility has to be at the forefront of it. So if you look at the physical changes we have, around age 40, you start to have a decline in vision. And, every person's unique and every person will have the impact of aging affect them differently and at different times. Hearing loss, muscle, mobility impairment, ambulatory decline, cognitive decline, these are all issues, unfortunately, that happen to individuals as we age. And I know this chart is very depressing at times to think that, you have a certain ability and that changes, but I mean, that's life, right? So whereas, someone who might have a disability, someone who is deaf or someone who is blind, they might have the resources and understand the assistive technologies available to them. For someone whose abilities are changing over time as you age, you might not be aware that there are these excellent assistive technologies out there that can benefit you. And they might not be intuitive to you. And I'll give you a personal example. My mom came to visit me, and we were watching TV. She just got hearing aids. They have batteries, and they whistle. And she doesn't really like them. They don't quite fit right. I mean, she just got them. And I saw that she took them out, and she set them on the couch. And we were watching TV together. And I could see, she wasn't as engaged. She wasn't kind of laughing with the jokes as we were watching it. So I went and I turned on closed captioning, and we're all familiar with closed captioning. She wasn't. She didn't even know it existed. So, her first question is, what is that? I mean, I can read that. It's what's happening. And I'm like, yeah, that's closed captioning. It was designed for the deaf community. It's on every TV. She didn't even know about it. So how do we expose all of our assistive technologies, and how do we make it intuitive for someone that ability is slowly changing? And this is where, we're at a different point, and we have a different relationship with technology, and that will continue to change. So I think that's really fascinating, and that will be one of the challenges. The other challenge with the aging demographic is that you don't, again, acquire one disability at a time. It's an overall impact from, the mobility to the vision to the hearing to the cognitive. The probability of having one or more disabilities for someone that is aging is very, very high. And you can see that on this graph. This kind of shows that the majority of the percentage of people over 65 with a disability, you can see a lot of them have various different kinds of disabilities. And what's interesting is we know when you look at the aging demographic and you look at people with disabilities, they both can benefit from accessible public environments. They both benefit from protection against discrimination, and they both need these assistive technologies. So this is one interesting crossroads we are at time, again, with there being more people over 65 than under 5, that we have ability to even more mainstream accessibility than ever before, because the need is going to be there. And you're going to have the governments interested in it. You're going to have the aging demographic demanding it. They want technology that they can use, that they can understand, that's intuitive, that meets their needs as their needs are changing. So, this is a really interesting space and a very interesting time. So let me ask you, in the group that's attending today, what are your worries about getting older? Is it losing your independence, acquiring a physical disability, having memory loss or dementia, are being outpaced by technology? What is your concern? I guess I should have none of the above. Maybe you don't have any of these concerns. But if you were to pick one, which one would you pick? I'm not sure how to see how many people have answered. Oh, do I hit vote?
Suzanne, we have the live poll up. You should be seeing the results.
Oh, okay.
We're displaying it in percent format. Let's give them like another 30 seconds to respond.
Sure. Wow. It's fascinating, isn't it? So if I was to look at our informal polling of the audience today, loss of memory and dementia, and I want to share you a story. I'm actually in Portland right now with one of our IDM clients. It's an assisted living provider, and we were in one of the rooms, and there was one of the patients had a note from their daughter, and it said, "Mom, you fell, on this date. This is where you're at right now. You're okay. We know where you are. We'll come to visit every day, blah, blah, blah." It was a note to remind her, so when she woke up, she realized where she was. And the idea of having loss of memory or dementia is something that, most people are afraid of. So we did an informal poll at CSUN last year, South by Southwest conference, and we had an online survey, and just like the audience today, from our population, I think it was 419 responses, 47% of the people worried most about losing their memory and suffering from dementia as they get older. So it's a really valid concern. And again, how could technology step in to help with someone, reorient them and help them with memory loss and dementia and kind of filling the gaps. And this is something that we're still exploring as technologists, but I think it's a very interesting area. So overall, I love this quote. It's from Laura, from the director of the Stanford Center of Longevity. "The challenge is converting a world built by and for the young into a world that supports and engages the population that live 100 years and beyond." And that's really one of our challenges, because a lot of this emerging technology could really benefit the aging demographic, but there is such a technology barrier for them. They're not able to adopt it. They're not the first adopters or the second adopters. So how do we bridge that divide? So I'm going to talk a little bit about just technology that's happening today. There is this onset of new multimodalities. Not that they weren't there before, but you're starting to see them in everyday technology. So on this graph, you see some images One is people on a subway reading papers back in yesteryears, and today, you see people on their mobile devices. Another image shows how people use typewriters and pen and paper. Now we have tablets and cell phones and laptops, just very different technology. If we look at the future of transportation, autonomous cars, ride sharing, that's all upon us. And if we look at different interactions from robots to something like Siri, voice interactions from Amazon Echo, all of this is these new ways to interact with technology. So the reason we have kind of that juxtaposition with yesteryears, I always pull from my personal experience. My father is 85 years old this year, and if you look at the number one device in his life, even today, it's the television. And don't touch his remote, don't sit in his chair, and he's watching that TV. He didn't ever really adopt cell phones. I mean, he has one, but he doesn't really like to use it. My father-in-law still likes the flip phone. He can't really see and understand the iPhones. He doesn't really like the touch. He likes the textile, the texture of the flip phone and pressing the buttons. So this becomes really challenging as technology is ever increasing and all these new technologies are emerging at a faster pace. How do we not leave anyone behind? And, especially if you think of the autonomous cars and ride shares, again, I'm out here at, assisted living provider. And most of the independent living, the folks that live on their own, when I talk with them, they all talk about losing their ability to drive. And so the autonomous car, what is that? Would they adopt it? I asked them, well, would you use Uber to use a ride share? And they look at me like I'm nuts. Like, no way am I going to let a stranger drive me around. So there's this whole idea that there's all of this technology out there just at their fingertips, but they're not able to understand it or use it. So how do we really begin to understand this greenfield opportunity to better serve the elders? And how do we make it intuitive? How do we make it accessible? How do we kind of give them the additional feedback they need to be successful while using technology? And I think this is really going to be a main area of innovation, this whole post-retirement space, from the human-computer interactions to accessibility to personalization, understanding the human behavior and have technology meet people where they're at and augmenting their ability. So if they do have memory decline, how can we augment their ability to remember the things in their life or their daily routine to keep them, independent for as long as possible? And then, how do we make sense of all of this data to really customize those interactions to them? So the elders of today, my dad, who's 85 and loves his TV, or my father-in-law that has a flip phone, is not the elders of tomorrow. If we look at the 60-year-olds today, they have a very different relationship with technology. And if we look at our children, like my children, who use Amazon Echo every day, and to them it's become ubiquitous. Like, what's the weather? Echo, what's the weather? Or Echo, what day is it? What time is it? Set the alarm. I mean, to them, just talking to another device and having it answer back is something that is going to be with them for the rest of their lives. So how do we ensure, someone that can't hear or someone that might have challenges speaking, how does that technology work for them? And so this is kind of some of our challenges. So I'm going to give you one more poll. So what emerging technologies will help manage the aging process the most? What is your opinion on that? Let me flip to the right chart. From, from mobile patient monitoring, so that would be like healing at home or aging at home, from artificial intelligence, maybe to help augment your abilities as your abilities decline, from new devices in your life, from robots, or wearables, or smart homes where you have ambient sensors that your home kind of knows who you are and adapts to your needs. What is your opinion as a poll? what do you think will most help manage the aging process? Wow, this is interesting. So it looks like most people picked wearables. That's so fascinating. So in our informal poll that we did, again, with CSUN, South by Southwest, and online, most people picked the Internet of Things, like smart homes. And what I think is not interesting about the wearables, what I find is that small screen becomes very challenging for people with that have vision impairment. But obviously, if you can have a different modality of speaking to it, the multimodality of a wearable device could become very beneficial, and that's something we need to definitely understand and explore and educate an aging demographic on how to get the most benefit from a wearable device. Again, from our poll, 1 in 3 folks said that they thought that the Internet of Things would help managing. So, and to me, that is essentially monitoring remotely through maybe a home environment that's instrumented how well someone is aging. So, are managing their aging or managing their independence. So it's very interesting. There's so much to explore. So I'm going to give you one more quote. So what we find from wearables to smart homes to all of these data sets that we collect, and continue to build, no one's really pulling together the meaning of it all. No one's really building that holistic view of someone's health, someone's change in ability, someone's managing their independence. They're not really pulling it all together into something actionable and simple. And I think that is the challenge. So through accessible design for the aging demographic, how do you pull in all that data you collect from a wearable and deliver meaningful insights that can be consumable, that can be accessible and consumable? And that's kind of part of what we'll talk about today. So I'm going to move on to global standards. As you all know, we have the WCAG 2.0 guidelines. There are a lot of different organizations that are aligning to WCAG from Section 508. That's been going on for quite some time, trying to make sure that that standard maps to, or the government regulations maps to the WCAG standard. The EU and also ISIS. These are all the global accessibility standards leading charge. But what's interesting, there isn't really a standard for aging. And I don't think there ever will be. I could be wrong. I'm not always correct. But, again, aging is the change of ability of time or acquiring disability. So I think the majority of standards out there are applicable to the aging demographic, and I don't think you necessarily need to change what's out there. It's all really applicable. However, I do think the use cases become a little different. And again, the dealing with multiple disabilities at a time is challenging, and cognitive disabilities. So with the WCAG 2.0, it was finalized in December 2008. So what is that? It's already 9 years old. They are working towards, the next wave of development. They have a first public working draft that was just published like a month or two ago. And I also put a link to the timeline of them working to it. And the challenge with standards is that, by the time they get adopted, they're almost outdated. There's always this next wave of technology that's coming in that wasn't addressed. So there are task force within, WCAG that are trying to address those gaps and get them into the WCAG standard as quickly as possible. Some of the ones that I think are interesting for aging would be users for low vision, small and touchscreen mobile devices. So that goes along with the poll of wearables, as being very important to the aging demographic. The other task force I think is very applicable to the aging demographic is the users with cognitive or learning disabilities. So that ties into, dementia, the challenges you have when you have, a decline in your cognitive awareness. And what else is interesting about that space is often, an elder or someone over 65 can get spooked when processing an online transaction. So there's a lot of techniques that can help them through the process, and I think Bo is going to cover some of them, because ultimately, that gap to technology and knowing if you're doing it right, or should I be giving this information to this person, all of this is this executive function skills that begin to decline as you age. So the ability to design an interface that gives a positive reinforcement that they are on the right track and they have this much longer to complete the transaction and kind of walks them through it, may be one way to help the aging demographic. So also along with standards, which was great, is that this was published, I think pretty much right after WCAG was published, this Developing Websites for Older People. So this was a paper that was created, as part of the WAY group to address accessible needs of older web users. So you'll see that all of this it's taking a filter on WCAG and saying these are the ones that are most applicable to the aging demographic. You still have to meet all of WCAG, but sometimes it's good to look at it and dissect it through different viewpoints to really understand what these requirements are asking you to do. So perceivable information, operable user interfaces and navigation, understanding of information and user interfaces, this is all really important for the aging demographic. So what this report does, it walks you through each one and gives you that use case for this population. So text sizes, and it will say, and I pulled this right from the report, many older people require large text due to decline in vision, including text in form fields and other controls. Color and contrast, I'm just going to pick out a few out of here. Most older people, color perception changes, and they lose contrast sensitivity. CAPTCHA is an issue with a lot of people. So older people with declining eyesight might not be able to discern the characters in CAPTCHA. So again, this report, I think, is, if you're interested in this space, I highly recommend reading through it, because it really does give you that use case for each one of these checkpoints, and it shows you in the report all of the ones that are real applicable to that use case. So understanding that, mouse use is challenging for some elders due to declining vision or dexterity, having sufficient time to read and process the information on a screen. All of these are very, very applicable to the aging demographic. So the list goes on and on. It's not that long of a report, but I love how they break it down into the different sections, and then what are the applicable WCAG checkpoints, and then what is the use case, why these are applicable to the aging demographic. So we do have this great body of work to begin to pull from, and then that's WCAG. So you also have ISIS, and this ISIS report just came out this month. It's called Active Aging. I highly recommend picking it up. It doesn't necessarily 100% deal with accessibility, but it really does hit upon a lot of the areas. User interface accessibility is in there, but cultural and linguistic adaptability and accessibility is also discussed. These are some of the issues that are out there that this ISO and the IEC JCT address. So we have these two standards. We have some great information. They're trying to converge into one standard to follow, or at least reference each other, which is great to make all of us that have to adhere to it better understand what is required of us and better understand why. So these are the standards I highly recommend researching and looking at, and that white tag report is really beneficial. You can pick up the latest copy of this Active Aging, which I think has, pretty fun. It's just showing the vitality and youthfulness that this aging demographic has, and kind of addresses this new longevity economy that's really going to drive accessibility standards. So I think this is very interesting. So I'll just say this quote because I think it's a really applicable one. The issues of disability for individuals, it's not whether but when, not so much which one, but how many and in what combination. So this is really talking about aging. So, again, it's not which one are you going to get, it's in what combination. And so with this aging demographic, with this global trend of people living longer, and most people as they age will have or acquire a disability, and a combination of them, how do we really address this with technology? And this is going to be ours to solve. So I think at this point, I get to turn it to Bo, who's going to talk about designing for the aging demographic.
Hi, thanks, Suzanne. So I'll introduce myself just a little bit more. You got a very brief introduction. I'm a user experience designer, actually an interaction designer by trade. I have my master's in HCI. And so, most of my career has been focused on heuristics for cognitive psychology and ability and that kind of area, designing interfaces to be easiest to use. I moved into accessibility a few years ago and started understanding how to design toward our standards and create good user experiences based on those standards. And this last quote that Suzanne read was really a good one because, excuse me, it really pinpoints the fact that we are going to have multiple disabilities as we get older. And how do we design for multiple disabilities happening at different times? That poses a really unique design challenge. Now, when we design for other demographics, different age groups, it's a lot easier to group people by sort of cognitive levels and by physical abilities. When we design for children, for instance, we can kind of group them into, 2 to 4 years old and 4 to 6 and kind of go like that, understanding that generally the development goes in certain stages, and we know what we want to, what colors to use and what words to use, and then we have this giant lump of people in the middle that we kind of generalize as your average adult, and we know what words to use there. But aging is different. It's gradual and it's personal, and all of our abilities are different as we age. Our techniques of adaptation are very unique. We, the elders that are adapting to technology are adapting much differently than perhaps others will as they age in the world of technology. And a lot of the guides and heuristics for user experience and accessibility, they don't cover elders. And one of the things, one of the questions that Suzanne just posed was, will there ever be a standard for elders? And I think that it makes more sense to understand the disabilities of elders and then design toward those disabilities. And that's kind of how we look at other standards, right? So basically, WCAG is doing a good job of presenting a foundation for building upon for standards. But it doesn't define usability and experience. And even before moving into aging, one of the biggest challenges for design is making a good usable experience and making it accessible at the same time. You'll find lots of people trying to just design to compliance, And that doesn't really mean that it's going to be a good experience, an easy to use interface. And we see that every day, that they aren't, even though they're compliant with WCAG. WCAG is still very weak on cognitive, and Suzanne mentioned this too. I think now there really is a lot of research on cognitive, and we're going to see a sharp increase in our standards there. But for now, it's not up to speed yet, and it doesn't really talk about alleviating fears and bridging the technology gaps that Suzanne was talking about, right? This is something that we have to pay attention to personally as we design. So what do? We need to understand our elders firsthand, right? This is normal and pretty standard advice for a designer. Understand your users. Well, elders are unique, right? So we need to understand their context and the fact that they have a different view of the world. Perhaps this technology revolution is only a small portion of their lives, and they understand technology in a completely different way. So we need to really go in and do some studies, do some research. Ethnography is a really good way to do it. Spend a day in the life and the shoes of someone. Watch how that, what the experiences are and what the troubles are and the problems, and then try to solve those problems. Interview elders. Create focus groups so you can sit down and ask questions and create discussions and really understand the context and the point of view, and gain empathy about and for your elder users. And like we said, build on WCAG. Follow heuristics for design for elders if they're out there. I'm going to present a few of them here. They're a little bit of some expanded ideas from the lists that Suzanne presented that are out there, and a little bit more detailed. And then use design thinking. And by design thinking, I really mean user-centered design. Do iterative design, research, sketch, test, review, get feedback, and validate your designs as you move through and iterate in an agile fashion, so that when you get to some solution, you know that you've gone the right direction the whole time, and you're actually developing this and designing this for the right people. So it's not all bad. I added this quote. I really like this quote because it made me feel better about getting older. Despite declining health, older people tend to be significantly happier and better at appreciating what they have. And that's from Ollie Campbell of Smashing Magazine. And I like to think that I'm going to become happier as I age. So what disabilities do we design for? This is pretty standard as far as UX design or interface design for disabilities. Cognitive, hearing, visual disabilities, physical disabilities in decline. And I added context and experience here, and this may go away at some point, but what I'm talking about here is really the technology gap that we have. And the experience and context of elders is so much different that we really need to pay attention and design for that. Now, it's not really a disability, so to speak, but I added it in there because I think it is a gap, and I guess you could call it a disability. It might be a little bit strong. Okay, so design for cognitive. Cognitive decline begins generally sometime in the mid to late 40s. We start to have reduced attention span, reduced short-term memory. We may lose our context in an interface more easily. We tend to lose focus more easily. And we have less generalization skill, and by generalization meaning the transfer between situations and association from one thing to another. If you've been around young children recently, I think this is probably the most shocking thing for me is they just associate so quickly something that they learned, yesterday to something that they saw today, maybe in completely different contexts. And that's how the human mind really grows so rapidly to associate and make these connections. Well, as we get older, we don't work as hard in our brain, and we don't have quite the ability to associate those things. So we want to make sure not to force people to continually relearn interactions and experiences. Difficult words take longer to recall, right? This was mentioned earlier about language, using simpler language. It's more difficult to multitask as we get older. And multitasking is kind of one of those oxymorons that, it's not really something that the human can do, is to do two things at once. We don't have split chameleon eyes where we can actually tackle two tasks. What it generally is referring to is the ability to quickly switch back and forth. And also, you might define a multitasker as someone that has their peripheral open all the time to external input that they can address. People that don't multitask, that tend to be not as good at it, and I don't think this is a negative whatsoever, they tend to focus on one thing, and they're not as quick to notice a chat window that pops up, or they might be bothered by that. They want to be more linear. As we get older, we're more easily overwhelmed. Cognitive load is a term that we use in design, meaning, how much are we taxing the brain, basically, in an overall fashion. And that happens a little bit quicker as we get older, and the older we get, more quickly. And you may see an elder just kind of give up on a task if it's too confusing, or just I'll just address that tomorrow. I'll do that tomorrow. That's that you get that type of behavior. And in our approach to the interface, we also tend, as we get older, we tend to go in a more linear fashion. So by that, I really mean that if you're reading a screen, for instance, so let's just say a website, and you would be more apt, or more, you'd have a tendency to go from beginning to end in a linear fashion. And you would think this is a really great thing to do, right? Okay, great. That's, as a designer, I finally get to present information to a user that is actually going to go through the design and read it. In most of our design talks, we're keeping content really short. We're letting users bounce around to scan and to skim, right? And it always seems like, well, if I could only get someone to read that, it would be better. But unfortunately, the results of tests for the linear approach tend to make it the task completion is a lower rate from a linear approach. And I think there are two reasons for this. That we're designing for quick scanning and bouncing around the page. And also, young eyes tend to bounce around quicker. So we're actually catering to this skim and scan type of behavior with our designs. And it's hard to tell whether the human brain wants to do that or we're designing and causing that chicken and egg syndrome. But that type of bouncing around, that type of scanning when our eyes get older is much more difficult. So what do we want to do to design for cognitive disabilities? Keep a very simple architecture. For example, 2 child branches for an iOS app. Keep very simple menu structures. We want to reduce visual noise and distractions. Keep clear and concise. Make things quick, and Suzanne mentioned this earlier, consider the context of limited connection and slow responses, right? So if we are designing, we need to make sure that if something goes slow, that we can keep a user in that interaction and not lose them. We want to use descriptive labels for confusing icons, and icons are a really interesting point when you're a designer, because for me, especially being an interaction designer, I tend to get hung up on icons and the metaphors that they represent, right? Each icon, for instance, a folder that's on screen, that is a representation, it's a metaphor for an actual file folder that you might put in a filing cabinet in your office. And so we understand that we put things in a folder, and therefore on a computer we open a folder and we put things in it, right? So you can see that's a direct metaphor to the real world. Well, considering you have to consider the context of someone that may be much older, and their context and their idea of these metaphors it's very important. And often when an icon, icons can be confusing anyway, but often when an icon is confusing, you'll hear a person say, well, why don't you just put a label next to it? Why don't you just put the word there? Why can't you just write save there instead of putting that save icon? And I think as a designer, we know that the save icon, it looks a lot better on the screen, but we really need to understand that it makes it much more usable to put the labels. We should keep our flow one task at a time. The iOS Human Interface Guidelines really Apple promotes this type of structure for their phones and their mobile devices already, and I think you probably, if you think about it, you may just hear or feel like iOS and Apple and iPhones are just easier to use. And you don't really know maybe why you're saying that. It just seems simpler, right? And as a user of both, I really see the differences. And Android, it's not more difficult, so necessarily, but it offers a lot more on one screen. A lot more. You have a lot more functionality just presented to you at once, which could be that can be a very difficult interface to understand for someone that is looking for a more linear flow. And iOS tends to want to go linearly through an experience, and then when you're done with that experience, it kind of steps you back out, and then you do something else, right? And I think that's why we see this simpler approach to design. So that's kind of it's a good type of example and pattern to follow when you're designing for elders. So that's the same thing, using a minimum amount of features. And then Suzanne mentioned this too, and this is kind of a theme, I think, through this whole presentation, is that we want to give positive reinforcement and promote technical independence, right? We want to make it a good experience, make it feel good, make it easy, and keep our users in a positive attitude. Oh, another thing is that with links, as we go in these linear fashion, and we may lose context, using different colored links is a very important thing to do. So that's kind of a heuristic of design, is to make sure that your links, when your visited links are clicked on, they turn a different color, and therefore we kind of get this we know where we've been, and we don't have to continue to click on things that we've already done. Okay, moving on to hearing disabilities. The hearing is a super important part of design, and probably one of the easiest to address, because there are so few actual rules that you need to follow. I mean, basically, we're talking about making any sounds that happen on the computer or on your device. Sorry, they have to be represented in another way, right? So as we get older, we find it harder to filter out background sounds and ambient noise. It's harder to localize sounds. It's hard to understand fast speech, right? And it's hard to hear higher pitches. Personally, I have an interesting ear problem, and I live on the West Coast, and I've been surfing my whole life, and so my ears decided to try to close up the ear canals to get the cold air and the wind and the cold water away from my ears and from my brain. So I have very narrow ear canals, and it's kind of a common problem. But I completely understand this ambient noise thing that happens, and when I'm in a crowded room and I'm talking to someone, sometimes their voice literally disappears. I cannot even hear anything coming out of their mouth, and it is one of the most disconcerting things that I've had happen to me, and I completely understand, this possible embarrassment and this sort of isolation that you feel when you can't hear something. And so it's very important that we make sure that all of our videos are captioned. We need to make sure that we provide any alternatives to any audio content, and then also stop any sounds and do not start any media noises. You need to allow the user to stop anything, and then make sure not to start anything automatically. And I know it drives me pretty crazy when I have a tab open and a video starts and I don't know where the sound is coming from and I can't find it, and that type of distraction becomes very difficult for us as we get older. And then don't use sound only as a feedback, beeps or any type of voice sound. Only, try to use haptic feedback and that type of thing, and visual feedback also. Vision difficulties. So we start losing our near vision at around age 40. Presbyopia, the hardening of our lens in our eye, and this is one of the most common. I never thought of it as a disability until I started designing and understanding that it really does become a disability. As you can see, this, we have a picture here of an elder gentleman. He has the text on his screen blown up super large, and he's having difficulty seeing the letters on the keys. You can see he's focusing really, really closely on the keyboard to know where the keys are. And so we are all going to understand this a lot better as we age, and we need to design appropriately and allow people to increase the size of the fonts and text and images on their screens. Did that jump a slide? I guess that's right. As we age, we have higher sensitivity to light and long adjustment period to changes. Like night driving blindness is one of the examples of this, right? Our rods and cones are not working quite the same. We're retaining light bouncing around in our eyes, and we can't quite adjust quickly. We get reduced color differentiation, especially blues, and I found this very interesting, right? Blue tends to be a color that people love to design with. Because one of the reasons that people love blue is that it doesn't have a lot of emotional connotation, right? It doesn't have a whole lot of feeling to it. It's supposed to be kind of calming, but there are some bright blues you can use that aren't. Well, if we use, you can end up using all these different hues of blue. Well, when you get older, you're not going to be able to see those different shades. So using good color contrast is really important. And then I talked a little bit about it earlier. We have difficulty scanning, right? And when you use your eyes to scan something, when you actually look across a room, and you kind of, like, if you think of a webcam or a video camera that pans a room, it kind of takes in everything. But when you look at something with your eyes, that's not the way it works. You actually skip from thing to thing, right? Your eyes jump and they pinpoint particular items that get relayed back to your brain. That particular scanning ability declines. And so we tend to, and that's why we tend to be more linear. So we have to kind of force ourselves to go thing to thing to thing without really looking around super quickly. So what can we do? Well, these are some heuristics. These are a little bit rhetorical for going back to the standards, but these are especially important for elders. Use large icons, 44 pixels, excuse me, 44 pixels by 44 pixel icons is kind of a rule of thumb, especially for mobile these days, and that's a nice area that's clickable with the finger or the mouse. Use large fonts. I like to say 16. There is no particular specific standard for fonts, but 16 is a nice size to start with as your foundation. Avoid fancy fonts. This reminds me of my 9-year-old who, when he has to type an assignment out and take it into his classroom, he will almost always choose the wonkiest fonts ever. They're just, and I don't really say anything because he's having a good time, but when I look at them, I can understand how difficult it really is to read some of these fonts. So stay away from serifs, that type of thing. And I think the good thing is that most modern fonts that are very popular right now are actually also very easy to read. Definitely allow adjustment of size by the user. The user should be able to blow things up by at least 200%. That is a WCAG guideline. Use color contrast. And so WCAG does have a standard for this, but you can make pretty disturbing color combinations even if they are compliant with the standards for color contrast. And this on the right side, we can see an example of two colors that probably should not be used on each other. There's a picture that has a pink background or a tan background with black font on it and a black dot, and that's very easy to read. And then there's a bright red block with a green square on it and then green text on it, and that says not as effective, and that one is hurting my eyes just to look at right now. We want to avoid pattern backgrounds, right? Anything that detracts from the actual task that we're going to be doing. Okay, so physical difficulties or disabilities include reduced fine motor ability. We might get tremors and have stiffness, right? This is gonna reduce our hand-eye coordination, knowing that we've already talked about our eyes, getting worse and having more difficulty scanning and focusing. Well, when we get physical disabilities on top of that, we tend to make more mistakes. We have unintentional clicks, and then one thing that's really important to remember is that and this is the same for young children too, we have trouble with mobile gestures, pinching, dragging, and multi-finger. So really, we're trying to design, a lot of people at mobile, you have all these new sort of APIs to tap into for all of the gestures and accelerometer and things, and people, designers especially, want to create a really new, really cool experience. Well, it's very important to make sure that we have a fallback, that we have a single tap for people that are unable to perhaps perform those particular actions. So we also want to make sure that all the interactions are keyboard accessible for those that can't use a pointer. For mobile, don't use these complex gestures, or if you're trying to create something cool, make sure you include a single tap method. Now, single tap is about the core easiest thing for users to do on mobile. Make clickable items large and clear with labels. We talked about that recently already. And provide obvious feedback for actions. So feedback is very important. Did I click that? What's happening? Why isn't anything happening? So using haptic feedback, which is sensory touch, vibration, something like that, and or visual feedback, and not just sound, obviously. Separate targets like links from each other, space them out from each other so they're easy to click. I think we all had the experience of having to load a full website onto our phone and seeing these tiny little links and trying to sort of stab in the dark at hoping that you can actually, open up the hours that the store is open that you're looking at, or some similar thing. Moving items such as pull-down menus should be limited. Anything that moves or shifts around on the screen is going to be difficult for elders to use. And don't require pixel-perfect pointing, right? We talked about this. Clickable areas are much easier to use. So This is from the Nielsen Norman Group. They came up with this statistic. 45% of seniors showed behaviors that indicated they were uncomfortable trying new things or hesitant to explore. Now, if you look at that quote, does that sound familiar for, say, children? Right? Does that sound familiar for younger demographics? I would say it's almost exactly the opposite, right? We have the younger demographics now who are starting to get really annoyed with anything that doesn't work, but they're definitely not afraid to explore. They're not afraid to click around, and they quickly, throw an iPad at a child, and they'll go as far as you let them, barring any passwords to the iTunes store so that they can buy more stuff. I mean, that's the exploration. Well, elders don't tend to, and this is a generalization, want to explore like that. They're afraid that they're going to break something, right? They're a little bit more uncomfortable. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about the technology gap, right? I mean, we have technology gap is kind of a loaded term. You may also hear technology gap for developing countries that don't have the technology, and that doesn't have anything to do with age, really. But we're talking about the technology gap for elders here, and that includes being less comfortable with technology, being risk averse rather than adventurous like kids are. Elders are afraid to break something, right? They're afraid to do something wrong. They tend to choose a familiar path over new techniques. And elders tend to have a fear of needing help. There's an embarrassment level of not understanding this, and I see this also with my parents who, if they have issues with their computers, they kind of used to ask me, and now I think they feel like it's their fault a little bit. And my dad, for instance, tends to take his computer down to the Apple store instead of asking me anymore. And I think that just shows kind of how things are changing now with how people understand technology. It's not a new thing that everybody feels okay not understanding, right? I think now it's sort of pervasive that we have this technology and everyone kind of gets it. And that might be isolating certain groups of older people. Elders tend to assign blame to themselves rather than assigning it to the technology, right? This is really important because as a designer, I think most of us all feel like if the user can't use something, it's really the designer's fault, right? You should be designing something that people can use. Unfortunately, you still hear the term, you might hear something like stupid users or user error, that type of thing, which is, that's not really what's happening. But elders tend to blame themselves, and that's an important thing to understand, right? And it's important to be reassuring in your interfaces and make sure that it's not, it's not giving that feeling to them. And then elders also have a reluctance to divulge personal information, which is probably a really smart reluctance, right? But that's something that they need to be reassured if you need to get information. So don't make any assumptions about technology and design. Question every element in the context of elders, right? This is important because we don't have heuristics. We don't have these particular rules for elders. We need to understand, what elders are we talking about? What context do they have? And actually get together with them. And if you have an interaction that you're used to using, look at it again with fresh eyes and try to understand with these disabilities that that we've talked about, will it still be easy to use, or could you possibly present a better experience? Keep things intuitive and clear, understand design metaphors and their origins, as we talked about, and provide clear and reassuring error messages. Error messages are the scary ones that, it's well, I failed at this. There's some sort of error. I don't really know, and I can't do it. I'll do it later. And you ask, well, what is the error? Well, I don't really understand it. It said something about unable to load. I don't know what it is. And when you get that type of conversation, that that's trouble. So as a designer, make sure that you're being clear with what's going on. It doesn't have to be clear with what's going on with the system. Just be clear with, there's something going on, and what can they do about that? So is this going to end? Well, I think Suzanne presented it well. Yeah, it probably will, right? And with AI and cognitive computing and some of the support and personalization that we have coming, yeah, maybe these everything technology is going to learn from us, and we will have that personal experience, right? And we'll see. But for now, we need to focus on these things. We can't just wait for the technology to happen. And that's why we really want something that understands us, right? And David Weinberger says, personalization is the automatic tailoring of sites and messages to the individuals viewing them so that we can feel that somewhere there's a piece of software that loves us for who we are, right? And the idea of software and love together seems a little weird, but that's the whole point, right? We want something that is going to integrate into our lives and understand us, and that's what we're trying to achieve. Okay, so then we come to poll question 3, and I think I was a little bit long in that, and I'm hoping, Suzanne, that we can finish on time. I'm sorry for my long-windedness. We have a poll question 3 here, and what we have is a little screenshot of an interface, and we're going to ask the people we're going to ask you to answer what design guidelines are shown in this example. And so I will describe this. This is kind of a simple interface of an application designed. Well, I'm going to stop there, and I'll describe this. We'll describe this picture in more detail after the poll. How does that sound?
I'm going to give everyone just a few more seconds to look at the image, and then we'll switch over to the poll.
Okay. All right, so we have a lot of people answering most all of these. I think all of the questions, right? And should I go backwards to show this slide again? Am I able to do that, or do you want to turn the poll back off? I think it said 70% of people said that it was all of the above. So if we look at this interface and really quickly, we do see a simple menu structure. In fact, there isn't really a menu. It's just a bunch of tiles, right, that we can see. We have labels we have very large icons and labels for them, big clickable areas, only 5, well, we have, if you count the features, we have a settings and we have a help on the top, which is nice, kind of a little alert. And so this is really a nice example of an easy design, right? And I think that most all of us would understand. We may not understand what the shopping basket is without the shopping label, but we can see that labels really help us with those icons. Okay, I'm going to pass it back to you, Suzanne. I'm sorry to leave you with such a short period of time here, but I think we might be still on schedule. So thank you very much.
Thanks, though. That was fantastic. I think we can do this. So this next section, I'm going to go a little bit quickly because I do want to leave time for questions. This is just IBM case studies. I just wanted to give you a sense of how we're looking at aging and how we're looking at these new interfaces and the different clients we're working with to do that. So the first one is, it was April 2015. We have a project with the Japan Post, and the link should be in the speaker notes. And what we're doing is we're deploying iPads in the hands of elders. And with the Japan Post is a large company in Japan. They're a post office, they're a bank. they actually touch a high percentage of the Japanese population every day. That's how integrated this company is with the Japanese people. So what they are offering is essentially a call and check service. So they deploy the iPads, and the elderly can request help. They can check on what's going on in their community, and it has a simple interface to call loved ones. So it's still an iPad, and it was in partnership with Apple that we did this, that we kind of put almost a filter over the iPad to make the technology not so daunting. And granted, you know, a young elder, someone 65, would not need this, but someone 85, 90 would. So this is the other challenge, because you cannot group all elders into one bucket. You know, we all have various abilities, and we will when we age, so you have to really understand what's the right kind of almost maybe filter or overlay or reduce of context that's appropriate for a specific person. So for this highly aged, super aged society, you know, we're testing out a you know, scaled down version of features on an iPad. And so we'll have great user feedback and user data that we can begin to really understand the challenges of putting an emergent technology for someone that's 85 into their hands and how well they adopt it. One of the things that did come out of this study is they do like the voice interaction. That was kind of surprising to us, so we're exploring that more. The next case study I just want to touch upon is one we're doing with Local Motors and the CTA Foundation. So a lot of people, it was even in the comments, Suzanne, you made how many people might not be comfortable with autonomous technology, and I agree, but if you think about someone losing their ability to drive, it's a big step. It's one of those vital life decisions, taking away car keys. It's very hard to give up the independence. How can we design a vehicle that could get someone where they need to go, but still let them feel comfortable in that vehicle, give them the additional cues, especially if they have declining cognitive ability or onset of dementia? What is the familiarity of the vehicle, the familiarity of the route they're going, where they wouldn't get spooked? So this is a project, and its aging population is on my mind because this is what the topic is about, but it's also with people with disabilities. You know, using an autonomous vehicle for someone who is blind, I mean, that opens up a whole world of convenience for them. So this is one of the projects we have to understand what is that technology, what is the interaction, what are the multimodalities that we need to make that experience satisfying and engaging and successful. And then I'm going to touch upon the last one, and this is actually my lab in Austin, Texas. This whole space is instrumented with Internet of Things. You can't see it, and you might, if you look closely, see the little sensors, but everything is censored, from the chairs, with the walls have motion sensors on it, everything, cabinets, furniture, you name it, it's all censored. And we're essentially learning the patterns of daily living, and this could be really beneficial. For example, if someone leaves the sink running, you know, what would be the effector to notify them? If they can't hear that the sink is running, will flashing a light help them? Would send them a text message on the phone or on their watch? You know, what is that engagement that we need in order to deliver the information that we can collect from an instrumented home? How do you convey the data and the information and the insights in a way that's consumable? So this is, you know, another project that we're working on to better understand. So I went through that section extremely fast because I wanted to leave you some time to ask questions. So the last quote of the day came from us. Aging shouldn't stop you from living the life you want to live. And that's what we really believe. We really, at the heart of our work in accessibility and aging, is to improve the quality of life of people. That's why I love what I do, Bo. I'm sure that's why you love what you do. We have a societal impact, and it feels wonderful to do the work we do. It's very rewarding, and we work very hard. So I'm going to open it up for questions.
I have a question on the phone line. When you're ready.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Susan and Bo, thank you for a great presentation. It was quite informative, and my goodness, lots to digest. So sort of two questions. One, you are talking about the Aging Lab and you're talking about the interaction with persons with disabilities. So how do you engage those people from those demographics to participate? Because I'm going to assume that even when you developed the lab and so on and so forth, it wasn't just based on research and assumptions. So that's question one. And question two has to do more with this whole transition to developing for aging. So today, we have a mix of both demographics. So in fact, we have a mix of a multitude of demographics. And things like, Facebook and so on, they're coming out with more and more of these really wonky things that are coming out of the box. How do you sort of leverage your development today so that it still engages both types of demographics, knowing that the personalization isn't quite there yet?
I'll take us out at this, though, at least the first one, and you can continue if you want.
Sure.
So with the idea of the focus groups, of designing, with the focus groups in mind, we really believe in client-driven research. So that's kind of why I wanted to put those case studies in there, talk a little bit really fast. Sorry about that. We just ran out of time. But about the clients we're working with, because that's our channel to the elder. That's how we understand the elder's needs. It's through the needs of our clients, and then, and their clients are the aging demographic. So with autonomous car, we have hackathons. We also, one of the lead researchers on that is blind. So, we're able to really understand through the right focus, what is this technology and how can it work and where are the gaps and how do we improve on the gaps. So it's really client-driven research, and we do bring in focus groups to best understand how to move forward with those projects and with the technology and what we really should be focusing on. The second question was about, the challenge of technology almost moving faster than the infrastructure we need to support the eliminating that barrier to that technology. So personalization, if it was here, wow, wouldn't that be great? We need it. We need it now. We needed it yesterday. And so I think that's really one of the challenges that we always struggle with. And I think that's also what standards struggle with, is because by the time the standard gets released, you all of a sudden have autonomous vehicles. And so how do you keep moving at a fast enough pace to fully understand and research? And I don't know if we'll ever solve that problem, to be quite honest. I think as these emerging technologies appear, that's when you start to notice the gaps, and that's when you say, okay, we need this type of personalization maybe is one of the solutions to fill that gap. So you're always running in parallel. And yeah. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but Bill, I'll let you speak up if you have.
Well, it's sort of, but
I have. Maybe I can elaborate a little. I think if it's the second question that you're more interested in, some more information. We tend to always have this balance between designing for, I guess, for the largest economic gain and then trying to cover also people with disabilities at the same time. And I think one thing that you're seeing, and the reason that there's this really big shift, and this is just a truth, right? This isn't a good truth, but this is just a truth. The market is enormous for the elderly and the aging demographic right now, and that is driving the need. And for us, it's a very altruistic, and for the market, I think that and this is good, the market is driving a lot more research and design for elderly. So if you're designing something really crazy for Facebook and you're trying to get the kids to adopt it and really, cause a stir, I think we have experts. There are experts at Facebook. There are experts at all of these companies that are the reality check about disabilities, about the different demographics that we have to serve. So it is difficult. It's a balance. There is no perfect answer there, right? I mean, if you the roller coaster is not for everybody. It just is something that you have to have the different groups speaking out, I think, when you're doing the development.
Thank you. I'll wait and see if others have questions first.
I have seen a few folks start to type. Please go ahead and enter any questions if you do have them. Those on the phone, again, #6 will unmute your phone if you'd like to ask a question.
So I'm just going to propose a follow-up to that question. So I go out and buy device, whether it be a desktop, laptop, or smartphone. It comes out of the box, and it's got all these wonderful features as you turn the on button. I'm a person who's a technology adopter and therefore could potentially understand how to set it up and do what I need to do, and I find it really, really cool. But if I'm, 60 or 65 or even 70 and I want a phone, and today you can't really buy a phone unless it's a smartphone, I want to be able to take it out of the box and make sure that I'm not inundated with all of these nice, features. Do you think we'll ever get to a place where, in fact, there is that balance where, you can actually buy a device, whether it be a phone, a laptop, or even a television nowadays, where, it is presented in such a way that it is not that complicated for people who are aging or people who have disabilities?
This is, as a designer, this is pretty much like where I live day to day, is just with, I'm astounded that products survive with the usability that they do. And I think that the market is going to start changing as it has taken an enormous and really big turn and pivot from functionality to usability in the last, I would say, 10 years. Right? Before, 10 years ago, it was all about functionality, and you would say something like, wow, look what this can do. And now what we're seeing is, yeah, of course, we know we can do that, but how well can we do it and how easy is it? And we're still in that transition. That's a good question. I don't think there's a real answer to it except that the market really is driving that, right? So if people stop buying interfaces that are terrible, I mean, honestly, my parents are both looking at iPhones now. They're in their mid-70s, and they don't know how to use their Android phones, and it's not that clear. It just gives you this interface, and you have really no idea what to do, right? And I think that type of selection, and the more people that do that, it's going to drive it. But I don't, and we're driving it in an altruistic fashion. But other than that, I'm still very frustrated with it, and I see that all the time.
So we did have one question. Go ahead, Bo.
I'm sorry, that wasn't really an answer. It was more like a commiserating.
That's okay.
We did have one question come into the chat box, so I'll read that out loud. Ugurkan asks, are there interesting differences between different generations? How do you think millennials will cope with aging?
I was just answering that. So, there are a lot of researchers that study the differences of the different generations. Everyone likes to classify that whole generation as one type of person. And obviously, I see the value of that just based on what they went through, whether, they were in World War I or in World War II or witnessed now. You think of these huge events that happened in our world and how it impacted them and how it impacted technology, how it impacted their lives. So I think there is, differences in generation in how they approach life, how they approach technology. Will millennials cope with aging well, or how do you think they will? I don't know. My goal is to try to make technology consumable, make it accessible, make it consumable. And if we're successful, by the time these millennials age, we will have personalization. We will have technology that adapts to their needs as their needs change. So, you know, I think that's a really interesting question, and you know, I think as technology changes, it will be interesting to see what's next wave that comes out that, you know, might make aging easier to cope with. I'm not sure if I quite answered your question because I don't really know if I have the answer, but I think it's a great question.
I have a really quick comment on that too, and that is that what we're starting to see from a design standpoint is that younger generations are much less accepting of things that don't work right and they don't work easily. They're much more, they're going to bounce around, and they're used to having things just work for them. They don't care how it works, they just want it to work, right? And so that's an interesting thing that's going to really push. I think it's going to push design in the direction of personalization and, you know, ubiquitous, pervasive information all around us that just guide us without having to, you know, take any effort whatsoever from us.
I think we're out of time now, guys. We are out of time, so
Okay.
go ahead quickly.
Okay. No, I was just going to say, not a very good social behavior change because it doesn't encourage our youth to problem solve, but it is the reality. That's all I was going to say.
Right.
Thank you. So a huge thank you to Bo and Suzanne. It was a really, really informative presentation. You guys did a great job. And a special thanks as well to our captionist, especially for bearing with us here a little bit over time. We do have a feedback survey, so please, please, please tell us what you thought of the presentation. And if you attended any of our previous presentations, you can give us some feedback on those as well. We do have some upcoming webinars. On Wednesday, May 24th, we will have a presentation on accessibility legislation in Europe, standard laws and how to interpret them. For those of you who may have already signed up for that a little bit early, please do note that we did have to change the date for that. The current date is May 24th. So if you have any questions or concerns about that, please feel free to email us at webinars@accessibilityassociation.org. and we'll be able to help you out with that. And then coming up in June, on Tuesday the 27th, we have a presentation on where is your organization on the accessibility maturity scale. And those should both be really great presentations, so we really hope to see you there. We will send out an email with some follow-up information and a link to that survey as well. And to see our full list of presentations and archived webinars for previous series and the rest of the 2017 series, please go to our website, accessibilityassociation.org, and go to the webinars section. To exit the webinar, you don't have to do anything special. Just go ahead and exit out of Adobe Connect. Those of you connected via phone, you can just hang up, and you'll be good to go. So thank you for joining us, and we're going to end the webinar now.